I'm always going to start off with a ONN update. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the first one. And that would be about this current situation with Cyril, Ramaphosa, and of course the GNU. Seems like it's always a popular one that I always, of course, start off with in many of my updates and everything else. But essentially, I just figured, this what has happened is particularly with the recent White House visit, and of course, the state of what's actually happening with this government of national unity. It is a talking point, and everybody is quite up in arms, and even people who pretty much are pretty politically apathetic or pretty much just don't care for politics are kind of wound up by the issue. And one of the main things, and it's also very relevant to what I was always stating about the fact that the racial tension in the country has pretty much come to the fore. And this is where we found ourselves, and particularly highlighting the issue which was central to all of this was, of course, Donald Trump and Cyril Ramaphosa going head to head. And of course, with the recent White House visit by the South African president and his contingency, and they pretty much tackled the first thing was about the white genocide definition. Of course, the infamous now incident where the whole camera was rolling, and of course, the television was pulled out, and the videographic evidence was compiled. And well, if you want to call it evidence, because it's not really pretty clear, but I'll say it was just a highlights video, and not every single thing was, of course, put in its proper context, I will say. However, when he pulled out the newspaper articles and all this, there is no doubt that there are attacks and violent attacks happening in farms to white farmers. But the important notion is that it's not only white people in the country who are known as farmers, because we can guarantee you that with the plots and everything else, there are the workers that also live on the plots. And with that stated, are the workers not getting attacked as well when these invasions happen? Chances are that's highly unlikely, right? Because if violence has come in and is pretty much meant that the people who are the owners or the plantation or the farm in itself are pretty much only just targeted because they're white, and they leave any valuables left around because the workers there are black, seems highly unlikely unless you are saying, well, the workers set it up, which I'm not saying that it's never happened, but you will find that it cannot always be the case, because at the end of the day, if they are employed there and there's a death that happens in the plantation, they're out of a job. And especially in a remote area where there are no companies, which Johan Rupert actually brought up, that a problem in South Africa is the unemployment first and foremost. And of course, once companies move out of a city, hence the unemployment then surges. And then you'll see a reperpetuation or a sort of an acceleration or an increase just in criminal activity as a result of that. So, of course, that is highly unlikely and not particularly plausible, unless you're going to point to me that, if people are so poverty-stricken that in order to get something from their plantation owners, would they rather not nick or make maybe what you call and categorize as petty crime, as in trying to steal something, as opposed to a full-on bloody murder, which they will always look like the first suspects or the primary suspects anyway, because they were nearby and miraculously they were just left alone. So yeah, you see the problem with that. Now, not to say, like I was saying, that going back to the fact that not only is it about the farm workers, as in that actually live on a plot, there's also the farm workers who come in during the day, and they would also perhaps head back home in the evenings, or whenever the shift is over with, or whatever is not made. Now, even in the setup of that, and it's a matter of the operation of a plantation, meaning that there's a high rate of turnover and they hire a high amount of casuals who come in and are not exactly employed formally, right? According to the BCEA, which is called the Basic Conditions of Employment Act here in South Africa. And you are in an unstructured environment, which is not exactly unionized and everything. So you cannot monitor as to who comes in and who comes out. There was a general complaint that here in South Africa as well, that in many places where there's farm workers, and what they'll normally do in order to improve productivity, they say they're commercial farmers, and meaning that they take their produce and take it straight to the market, and unnecessarily are planting in order to sustain the isn't to actually eat or whatever it is. And of course selling of the produce is very secondary at that point, or just to get in a little bit of extra cash. But essentially what that would entail is the fact that the operation would mean that, because of the fact that unemployment or employment is a little bit unreliable, so that they're always getting in new faces, it would also then leave them more prone to attacks, because there are people just coming in and they're going out the same way. And a lot of the times these are undocumented illegal immigrants who are coming in and working in because of the fact that they are cheaper, and in order to circumvent what people will normally categorize as racist laws. Okay, and I'm not saying that that's particularly going down to triple BE and everything, but we're looking at the sense of minimum wage and everything, because people will also look at that as some sort of woke principle. But in an economy that's not exactly growing, and when people are trying to scale and to find ways to become more profitable, it just means that you just put down the labor costs and cut and actually decrease those in order to pretty much ensure that your business is more profitable. And as a result, it leaves you more prone to the fact that, hang on, people are cutting corners and everything, and then they start attracting enemies from, let's say, situations that maybe normally wouldn't have happened. And then that's when it brings in things like, okay, fine, we're going to now get into organized crime, and we're going to plot an invasion. Yeah, once because we know this owner, and this is the way they clock out, and they lock up here and lock up here at a certain time. Unfortunately, that's what normally just happens. And even in normal neighborhoods that are not in more, let's say, in urban areas where there's more policing, and meaning that there are more police units and police cars patrolling within a particular sort of urban area or a particular suburb or town, whatever it is, and particular precincts. That's the word I was actually looking for. As opposed to what's happening in the rural areas, where there's a whole lot of land between getting from one farm to the other farm. You have to cover a whole lot of distance, which makes it policing a little bit more challenging, especially if they're assailants and they're moving through these bushes and everything. And it's not like you have to walk across a particular street or get into a particular corner in order to make a getaway. People can even disperse and everything, and that makes it a little challenging, because even I have an uncle that's actually a farmer, and he's a livestock farmer in the Free State. And he tells me that, if anything, he actually lives out in Tabanchu, right, which is borderline with, I think it's an hour away from the Lesotho border. So there are guys from Lesotho who come in, steal the livestock, and then they go over the border again. And the police are not even helpful. So I just have to give you some sort of emphasis as to how it even goes across the demographics as far as the farming and crime in the farm. That it's the crime, it doesn't actually work according to a particular demographic, or meaning that it's not necessarily just aimed at one particular genetic disposition at all. Because let's face it here, the division that's happening here in South Africa is actually predetermined on things that are not of your personal or what's in your control. Because The way you appear and whatever skin you're born in, that's got nothing to do with you. That's got something to do with God. Of course, your parents have the say in that, because of the fact that they pretty much select their partner, or however the child comes out looking, meaning that there's a highly likelihood they're going to come out looking more like this particular phenotypes, as opposed to let's say somebody else who's pretty much white or categorized as another race, and that's also a percentage game, because we've seen genetic variations happen all the time. But I'm not getting into that, and I sound like I'm digressing, but essentially what I'm just saying here is that, of course, God is the one that puts the life into the body, as he created everything anyway. And people are just looking at the wrong things, unfortunately, and getting very, very worked up. Because why? Even I'm saying, I'm very disappointed in a man that you guys know that I really, really love in Donald Trump and respect. And I do think that, and no doubt that what he's doing is very, very true. And of course, there are people applauding this, and especially that I'm a bit disappointed in the conservative networks and people who are very pro-Trump, right? And no one was probably more pro-Trump than I am. Or I'm not even saying I've changed that at all. But here is what is actually a divisive issue. And instead of handling it from a lens of, hang on, South Africa has a problem, but it's been done in a way that is just looking at, let's just look and focus on one particular group and get them over here for their own actual, what is actually down to their own agenda. Because when he went around to places like Wyoming, and I'm talking as someone who follows Trump, who actually, I don't mean I follow Trump in the sense of I follow him, like I follow Christ. No, that's not what I'm saying. As in, I actually keep up with these activities. I was actually listening to the rallies because I was quite interested in the things that were happening, particularly that God was pouring out a lot of things pertaining to this man, to me, right? And what I was doing was just keeping in touch and noticing what is actually happening here with the court cases, etc., 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 and the election outcomes. And the one thing was to get back and reboot the economy, particularly from an agricultural sectoral point of view, because he is chief and foremost an incredible industrialist. And people don't give him enough credit for this. And what I've been saying to my friends is that why he didn't go the special talents route and he went the refugee route was just to bring down the price, meaning that he could get people, drive up a crisis, get people over very cheaply. And mainly because of the fact that he didn't like what Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC did to him and the way they treated him. So he's like, okay, cool. They got me. Now I'm going to get them back. And this is how he decided to hit. That's exactly what it is. And I actually noticed even one comment where somebody actually stated that, you know what, none of this noise would have happened if they had just gotten them in on a special talents visa instead of this refugee thing. Because, I mean, with the refugee thing, it can be pretty much on anything. And especially if someone feels like, oh, we're frightened. And going back to what I always stated about the fact that, when it comes to this first world and third world distinction and designation, is that with this first world thing, mainly people are really just paying for the government to take care of them. Quite frankly, because, when you look at the first world determination, and I'm not saying that I'm trying to be an economist or trying to be economical in terms of or trying to be textbook with my definition of that, but essentially you are getting this infrastructure that is has been developed and everything, and you are paying a good quid or good high amount of taxes in order to just live there, so that you have to make do with less in terms of what you can get in your personal private capacity. For instance, that you don't pay for medical aid, and you don't pay for your medical cover. The government has got you. So it's those sort of things that they're getting in. And now getting in good labor is something that it can come in quite a premium. And they're not going to look at getting it in from other first world countries, because that's going to cost them a bit. The best thing is to get them from, oh, hang on, these third world emerging things. And I'm like, oh, well, let's take the best of the bunch and bring them there. And of course, we saw in 2020 as to what happens. And the truth is, all these governments collude. That's all they do. Look out for each other and do certain things because, and not the point that I actually gathered by myself, but this was Des on this channel called Beyond Politics. If you ever heard of this channel called Beyond Politics with, it used to be called 007 Des or something, check that out and you'll see that he covers that stuff comprehensively. But what he stated was the fact that people are just missing the point that this is all about putting together this policing aspects and of course putting up things like security aspects. And this is where one of my professions comes in because I know things about the United Nations goals, and especially pertaining to what happens within urban development and making smart cities. And that's where that side of that comes in. And that is the one thing about connectivity. And the main thing is this, is that if you look at what actually happens in China when it comes to social security scoring and all that sort of thing that happens there, and that is also pretty much why when you look at what's going to happen even with the beast system and this monitoring, tracking sort of thing, is that it's about understanding the fundamental development of grading people's work. So if you look at what happened in my previous podcast, and particularly pertaining to the one about the intelligence gathering for the artificial human, and also when you look at the one that preceded that was being a company man, that it's all about grading, about works, and about your scorekeeping, meaning that your market value is what determines your human worth. So make no mistakes that what is determined and why God himself got me out of this whole traditional work system was for the mere fact that not because I couldn't cut it, but again, when you go down and drink that Kool-Aid or that water fountain for too long, you'll start believing this nonsense that spews out of it. And of course, this whole culture that comes with that is just leading to something down the line, which is actually quite dangerous. And the political system, with that said, is what gives the credence or the substantive measures in order to give the bylaws and the regulations in order to justify all of this, and then put you in a social grading, which then puts you in that whole social status. And understand that to be part of this B system means that you go along with what the Lord Jesus Christ calls as the world, right? And that's all it's about, that people who have put their trust in money effectively, and all they're doing is just working together. And if you recall, and I'm going to quote this again when I get into the main segment of the show, when I was doing episode 7 of Calling of a Ravenous Bird, where the theme was about the fact that God using the pandemic to actually give special revelations and to give the truth about certain matters. Now, it was a very general scope, but it was all encompassing and all saying as to set the mantra, because it wasn't really a prophecy as per se to pretty much put a particular determination or to say a certain event is happening. Not at all. It was just to give more emphasis as to why he allowed this whole thing to happen, because it was leading to somewhere, and it was about just putting out the truth there. Because you get two types of prophecies. Once again, one that is foretelling and the other one that is forthtelling. So the one that's forthtelling is about bringing the truth to light, which is actually saying, oh, we get it. That's why this is all happening. So the why and why it's happening right now is what's actually more important, and you hold on to that and then you put the pieces and the puzzles together down the line. So that's where we're sitting right now. And I had to take the long way around about this so that people just understand that what actually happens, with and all of this and where it's going to lead to down the line. So essentially, when this political system goes by the wayside, there are things that I, of course, put out in the prophecies. And for one, that has already been pretty much stated about the election being rigged. Now, Nhlamulo Ndlela from the MK party, or Mkonto Wesizwe party, he actually stated on his previous podcast with where he made his appearance on SMWX podcast, and you're speaking there with Sizwe Mpofu Walsh about the fact that the election was rigged, and he says, in reality, the ANC is a 25% party. Now, he's saying all of this, and if you noticed and if you actually checked out the whole interview, and I'm sorry that I'm giving out spoilers, but he was praising Jacob Zuma the whole way through, like, oh, Zuma is this great strategic leader, etc., etc., etc. And now he's talking about and bringing out details that, no, the election was actually rigged. We were supposed to control KwaZulu-Natal, but however, we had to settle for this. But here's where I'm going to call him out on his disingenuous nature and everything, because he's setting up, right? And what they're doing is that, if you recall that I prophesied that Jacob Zuma is going to get arrested. That is something that is going to happen because Cyril Ramaphosa is going to have to justify keeping the lights on, for one, and also he's going to have to start banging the gavel and bringing in consequences for people who are engaging in state capture. Not that he's not involved, or his cronies or current crop of cronies and the GNU are not doing any state capture. They clearly are. But however, he's going to have to justify keeping the lights on because Eskom is going bankrupt, and in order to ensure that there's not going to be any civil disobedience, and we're already seeing signs of that as to what happened in Deep Kloof in Soweto, right? So we already saw that people were already making a service delivery protest, and they've said that if COJs in City of Joburg does not meet their demands, they're going to continue the protest. Two people died, unfortunately, and they looted a truck there. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. And what I actually stated is that once Soweto sneezes, the rest of the country normally, if you look, always catches the flu. So watch that, because roads were blocked. And then, of course, with that, meaning that people were burning tires and all that sort of nonsense. And that's why the one truck got looted with a Lucky Star tin fish there in them. And as a result, the truck tried to get away and then two people got killed. And yeah, pretty sad events. But essentially, that's why why Cyril Ramaphosa has to actually arrest Jacob Zuma in order to keep the lights on, because the service delivery thing is becoming a problem and the GNU are just not coping with this mechanism and this whole problem at the moment. And of course, the other thing was not only away from what the MK actually said, and the MK party representative, which is Nhlamulo Ndlela, what am I saying? He's now a member of parliament, but he was initially just the spokesperson for the party. If you notice that as soon as they got in, the first thing they did was actually take the results, and they're saying the elections were rigged. But you know what happened? The IEC said they're going to hold back the party funding. And if you noticed, they were actually staying away from parliament, and then all of a sudden, very quickly, they sent all their representatives or their parliamentarians to parliament to get sworn in. And that was the end of it. So as a result, right now, why is Nhlamulo Ndlela now bringing this up on a public platform? It's because it's a protective measure that they're just in case they're going to remind us of what happened in 2021 with the severe looting. And we've already seen that the civilians in amongst themselves are prepared to start looting because they've got nothing to lose. People are losing jobs by them daily, and that's something I put about the fact that once you see Massmart, which is the chain store that is owned by Walmart in the USA, and locally they're called Massmart because they control Macro, Game, and it was the Builder's Warehouse. And when you start seeing that pretty much that company pulling out of the market or going bankrupt, then you're going to start seeing the fact that the unemployment in the country is actually going to be on a grand scale and is going to reach the pinnacle at that point. Because if you recall, even the title itself, I think it was Calling of a Ravenous Bird number 8, funny enough. I think it was number 8, but I could be wrong. But it's pretty much called mass job losses, as far as if you notice that the coincidence is coinciding with the event of Massmart getting out of the company, as in getting out of the whole country. And I did say to you at that point, it's about that department store model pretty much getting out of the country, meaning that there's going to be another American chain store coming in, and people will probably figure out who it is, and they're going to come in, buy the properties that previously were on their own independent sites and not necessarily within the malls, but they're going to be smaller stores instead of these big department stores like you saw with Macro. And I just made a mention that Macro is that model, but then Game is the one that is actually inside the malls. So with that, it's going to lead to, of course, the property sector in South Africa being quite, as in commercial property, being quite a problem, and the malls are going to struggle, just quite frankly. Already signs of it are happening, but I'm not going to digress off of that one. I've said a bit too much on that, and I think maybe I should just get on the next person who actually said something about the elections quite frankly, but he didn't say everything. What he said was, he hinted at and this is Neil de Beer. Now, I forgot the name of his party, but Neil de Beer, who pretty much hinted at the fact that there was a golden handshake, and he says everything was done by agreement, because if you notice what I said in my prophecy itself, that the DA was supposed to go into parliament, parliament as well, but going to leadership as the ones who actually are leading and actually governing the country. However, it was stopped because the ANC rigged the election, right? And then everybody else who joined in was, frankly, as a result, you see this GNU were the ones also pretty much co-opting in rigging the election. And initially, what was supposed to happen was the DA, headed up by John Steenhuisen, and that's what Neil de Beer was saying as well, that John Steenhuisen and this coalition and this multi-pact, this multi-party charter, which is the Moon Pact, right, as they called it, were the ones supposed to govern, and he himself said he had an executive cabinet ready for him, but there was a golden handshake, and eventually ANC factored themselves in, and people went, as you noticed, and became the GNU, and he stayed on that side, which was originally supposed to take over with that. And he's also made mention of the fact that every time he speaks more and gives more details around this truth, death threats are always sent his way. So check out Neil de Beer and hear what he has to say. He always appears on Biz News. Hear what he has to say, and you'll get and put everything together. And also remember what I got in February 2024 as far as that prophecy that I got about that. I didn't know anything about this Moonshot Pact at the time, and I got that information about the rigging of the election then. And it was February 1st. Yeah, exactly. That's when I got that. I still remember quite distinctly. And there was no set date for the election at the time, if you also recall. And then more details came in about this Moonshot Pact, and then all of a sudden there was this GNU thing. And of course, I looked stupid in the sense that I'm saying that, well, the elections were rigged, and this is what's going to happen, that people are going to start getting angst as one of the reasons as to get this backlash that's aimed at the ANC, not only at the ANC, but of course, now we're seeing that the ANC in bed with the Democratic Alliance. And me looking stupid, of course, put it out there, but, just because God's word was delayed doesn't mean that it's not, the inevitability is not going to happen. So, from two fronts, look what Neil de Beer is saying, and also what Nhlamulo Ndlela of the MK party saying about the rigging of the election. That is quite something. Now, as a result of once this whole boiling point is actually it's actually reaches its pinnacle, we're going to see communities pretty much having to have their order restored. And that's when this whole community leaders thing, when I was speaking about, is going to come to the fore, where it's I explained it to the 70 elders that were appointed by Moses, which is also was a precursor of the 70 disciples who actually the Lord Jesus commissioned, as and sending them out. Of course, people know the 12 that actually followed him around, but then there were those that actually there were amounted to about 70 as well. So that is pretty much not that I saw 70 people or 70 elders. No. There were two ones that I actually particularly saw. One in the Arabic or Muslim community, and then there was one in the colored community run by a gangster, pretty much. So those were the two ones that were, of course, in the midst of this whole racial fighting and racial tension. As I'm going back to this whole issue with Donald Trump and everything else, this racial tension and division is being built up, unfortunately. But it's just the inevitability of things, and one where we'll have to deal with. And we're already seeing communities pretty much policing themselves. For instance, like around Eastgate, and that particular area heading towards around Modderfontein, as in Modderfontein Road, that you're seeing that there are Chinese communities that pretty much have their own police station. And a lot of them are Chinese who are actually just coming in. And if you recall that there's also ties in with another prophecy that I was given about the Chinese dissidents, as in those who are fleeing Christian persecution in China and then heading towards South Africa for safety, that you're going to see more and more of this, just as an example. And apparently even Trade Route Mall outside by Lenasia there is pretty much an Islamic or Muslim mall, because you pretty much can't even get any sort of, you can't buy any alcohol over there because, everything is pretty much all halal. So I've never been to Trade Route Mall as per se. I've just been outside of that. I've never really gone inside, but essentially it's pretty different to what I remembered, because it was actually built around the mid 2000s, if I still remember. It was still relatively new at the time, but subsequently, and heading to that, and of course just giving you a slight synopsis of what to expect with the commercial property in the malls here in South Africa, it's pretty much telling as to what to expect. So we're going to be in for a rough ride, South Africa, as I always lament. But I've got another update, which I'm going to touch on in just a second.